What is decoupling? When one of the co-owners of a private property sells his share to the other party, freeing up her name to buy another property as a first-time buyer. The buyer or the stayer of this arrangement then becomes the sole owner of the existing property, freeing up her name as the seller or a withdrawer to buy another property as a first-time buyer. Why do owners decouple? Well, for one very obvious reason is to save the 17% ABSD that would have been levied on Singapore citizens shall they buy a second property. And this is an increase from 12% as of 16th of December 2021.
For example, for a $1 million property purchase, if Singapore citizen buys as a first property, the BSD rate is 24,500. If the Singapore citizen buys a $1 million property as a second property, then the BSD rate is 24,500 plus 17% ABSD, which comes to 170,000. That would equal to $194,600, which is about 20% of the property price. Similarly, if the Singapore citizen buys a $1.5 million property as a first property, then the BSD rate is 44,600. If Singapore citizen buys a $1.5 million property as a second property, the BSD plus the ABSD is $299,600. The difference in stamp duty payable if Singapore citizen buys a $1.5 million property as the first property compared to buying it as a second property is calculated as 299,600 minus 44,600, which is equals to 255,000. In another example, if Singapore citizen buys a $2 million property as a first property, the BSD rate is 64,600. If Singapore citizen buys a $2 million property as a second property, the BSD rate plus the ABSD rate is 404,600. The difference in stamp duty payable if Singapore citizen buys a $2 million property as a first property compared to buying it as a second property is calculated as 404,600 minus 64,600. That equals to 340,000, which is the 17% ABSD on the second property.
Minimum cash down payment.
Your first home purchase requires only up to 5% cash down payment if you took up a bank loan, but your second property requires a 25% cash down payment of the property's valuation limit. This is the difference of 20% cash in terms of purchasing your first and your second property. For example, if Singapore citizen buys a $1 million property as a first property, 5% cash down payment would be $50,000. If Singapore citizen buys a $1 million property as a second property, then 25% cash down payment will work out to $250,000. If Singapore citizen buys a $1.5 million property as a first property, 5% cash down payment will work out to $75,000. If Singapore citizen buys a $1.5 million property as a second property, then the 25% cash down payment is $375,000. If Singapore citizen buys a $2 million property as the first property, then the 5% cash down payment works out to $100,000. If the Singapore citizen buys a $2 million property as a second property, then the 25% cash down payment works out to $500,000.
Loan to value ratio.
If you are buying your first home, you are eligible to borrow up to 75% of the property value if you are taking up a bank loan. You are eligible for 55% if the loan tenure is more than 30 years or it extends past age 65. Your LTV ratio drops to 45% for loan tenure up to 30 years for your second housing loan for tenures up to 30 years. If the loan tenure goes beyond 25 years or beyond your 65th birthday, then your LTV drops to 30%. As you can see, if you're buying a second property while still paying mortgage on your first home, you will need significantly more cash. Based on property valuation of $1.5 million, then this will work out to $375,000 for cash down payment, $255,000 for ABSD, $44,600 for BSD, which is your buyer's stamp duty. Pay the remaining $450,000 in cash or CPF or both. And lastly, take up a loan of $675,000.
For PR doing decoupling, take note that a 5% ABSD will still be levied as it is the rate for PR owning a first property.
For example, if a PR couple decouples their existing property that is valued at $1 million, the buyer cum sole owner will have to pay BSD plus 5% ABSD of the half share of the $500,000 that is calculated as follows. Buyer stamp duty $9,600 plus 5% ABSD, which is $25,000. That works out to total stamp duty payable of $34,600. When withdrawer frees himself or herself to buy another property as a first-time buyer, take note that if the PR buys a $1.5 million property as a first property, BSD rate of $44,600 plus 5% ABSD, which is $75,000, equals to total stamp duty payable by the PR, which works out to $119,600. If PR buys a $1.5 million property as a second property, then the calculation works out to be BSD rate of $44,600 plus 25% ABSD, which is $375,000, equals to total stamp duty payable of $419,600. This is still a substantial savings and lesser amount compared to the 25% ABSD levied on the PR to buy a second property. The difference in stamp duty payable if PR buys a $1.5 million property as a first property compared to buying it as a second property works out to $419,600 minus $119,600 equals to $300,000. If PR buys a $2 million property as a first property, the BSD rate is $64,600 plus 5% ABSD, which works out to $100,000. Then the total stamp duty payable is $164,600. If the same PR buys a $2 million property as a second property, then the calculation works out to BSD of $64,600 plus 25% ABSD, which comes out to about $500,000. Then the total stamp duty payable by the PR equals to total stamp duty payable of $564,600.
Still, substantial savings and lesser amount compared to the 25% of ABSD levied on PR to buy a second property.
The difference in stamp duty payable if PR buys a $2 million property as a first property compared to buying it as a second property is $564,600 minus $164,600 equals to $400,000.
So what are the costs involved? Well, firstly, it will be your conveyancing fee that range from $6,000 to $7,000. Second, it will be your stamp duties in the form of buyer's stamp duty and additional buyer's stamp duty. Third, it will be your prepayment, penalty and lock-in period. And lastly, the refund to CPF ordinary account. So what are the risks involved? Well, there are 5 points to take note of. Number 1 will be loss of job. So it is essential for you to have an income buffer. 2, economic factors such as inflation, rising interest rate, etc. 3, not enough money to pay back CPF ordinary account. 4, not enough loan. This is especially for homemakers and retirees who are thinking of decoupling. And 5 will be the divorce, as it is a messy process and one spouse may declare that it is not valid. There are 4 parties involved in this process. Number 1 will be the banker, who will determine your loan eligibility and valuation. Number 2, your lawyer, who will be assisting you in all the legal procedures. Number 3, your trusted advisor, who will be assisting you in calculation, timeline, as well as seller stamp duty. And lastly, the CPF, that will determine when your CPF money comes back to your CPF ordinary account before you go and purchase your property. So what is your intention to decouple? Buying a second property comes with a lot more financial responsibility compared to your first one. So, are you buying it for investment or are you using it as a second home? So what is the timeline involved? Well, it takes between 10 weeks to 14 weeks to complete the deal. However, once you have exercised the option, then you are free to put a deposit for another property. Important! Please take note of the Stamp Duties Act. Stamp Duties Act 1929, Section 33A.
Commissioner to disregard certain transactions and dispositions. 33A. Subsection 2 applies where the Commissioner is satisfied that the purpose or effect of any arrangement, directly or indirectly, A. To alter the incidence of any duty that is payable or that would otherwise have been payable by any person. B. To relieve any person from any liability to pay duty. Or C. To reduce or avoid any liability imposed or that would otherwise have been imposed on any person by this act. Evading or paying less stamp duty by executing an instrument where facts and circumstances are not fully and truly set forth is an offence under Section 62 of the Stamp Duties Act, and anyone caught in this act shall be guilty of an offence and shall be liable on conviction to a fine not exceeding $10,000 or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years or both.
So who is Jaimie Ho? I'm your trusted advisor with finance background and 14 years of industry experience ready to serve. My strength is to assist couples from ages 39 to 60 to decouple smoothly and to own their second property. Decoupling is a complex procedure not to be taken lightly. As your trusted advisor, it is crucial to look at your overall portfolio, not just simply buying or selling. It is of our interest and duty to make sure that all risks are being explained to you and to remind you that investing in property is a long-term commitment. If this is something that you are thinking of, you can reach me at 9107-2868. I'm Jaimie Ho, and I'll see you soon.